The champagne flutes shattered first crystal fragments, catching the afternoon light, like deadly confetti, as the patio began its slow, horrifying descent. Karen's wedding guests screamed, designer heels scrambling for purchase on tilting marble, as the $20,000 reception she'd stolen from her neighbor's property became a nightmare of collapsing concrete and twisted steel. But as Maya watched from her kitchen window, coffee mug frozen halfway to her lips, she realized the real catastrophe wasn't the structural failure, was what Karen had hidden beneath that patio for the past 6 months. Maya Rodriguez had been staring at the violation notice for exactly 7 minutes when the first white van pulled into her driveway. She didn't recognize the company logo Celestial Events and Catering, but she definitely recognized the woman stepping out of the passenger side. Karen Whitmore, HOA Board President, Neighborhood Watch Coordinator, and the human embodiment of a migraine headache wrapped in Lululemon athleisure. "Excuse me," Maya called through her screen door, "but you're on private property." A perfectly veneered smile never wavered as she marched toward the front steps, clipboard in hand like a weapon. "Actually, Maya, I need to discuss some exciting developments regarding your ... situation." The violation notice crumpled in Maya's fist. 3 weeks. That's how long Karen had given her to remedy the unauthorized patio extension that Maya's late husband had built 2 years ago. The same patio that had passed city inspection, received proper permits, and existed entirely within Maya's property lines. The same patio Karen had been trying to force her to demolish since Miguel's funeral 6 months ago. What situation? Maya stepped outside, noting how the catering van was already unloading white linens and chair covers. "And why are there people setting up in my backyard?" "Well, that's the wonderful news." Karen's voice hit that particular pitch that made neighborhood dogs howl. "The HOA board has voted to approve a temporary use permit for your patio space. We're hosting my daughter Brittany's wedding reception there this afternoon." Maya blinked. "My patio, the contested patio, yes. Since you've been so resistant to removing the unauthorized structure, we've decided to demonstrate its potential safety hazards by hosting a community event. Don't worry, we've secured liability insurance." A second van arrived, this one carrying what appeared to be a small orchestra. Maya watched in stunned silence as uniformed workers began streaming through her side gate, hauling sound equipment and massive floral arrangements toward her private backyard. "You can't be serious." "Oh, but I am," Karen's clipboard snapped. Against her manicured nails, according to HOA Covenant 7.2b, any structure in violation of community standards may be subject to community use, pending resolution of said violation. It's all perfectly legal. Maya's neighbor, Mrs. Chen, appeared at her fence line, garden shears forgotten in her arthritic hands. "Karen, what in God's name are you doing? Community building, Helen? Something you'd understand if you attended HOA meetings." Karen didn't even glance in Mrs. Chen's direction. "Maya, I'll need you to clear any personal items from the patio area. The ceremony begins at 4. "The ceremony?" Maya's voice was dangerously quiet. "On my patio, that my husband built with his own hands before he died." Karen's expression flickered just for a moment before the corporate smile returned. "I understand this is emotional, but Miguel's departure ... doesn't change property law. The structure remains unauthorized." Mrs. Chen made a sound like a wounded animal. Even the catering staff had stopped moving, sensing the sudden shift in atmospheric pressure. Maya stepped closer, close enough to smell Karen's aggressive perfume and see the tiny crack in her foundation makeup. "Get off my property." "I'm afraid that's not possible. The permit has been filed with the county. The deposit has been paid. Brittany's guests will begin arriving in 3 hours." Karen's voice carried that particular brand of authority that came from years of wielding clipboard power over suburban landscapes. "Of course, if you'd like to resolve this quickly, I have the demolition contracts right here. Sign, and we'll move the reception to the community center." The trap? Maya saw it now, crystalline clear, like the champagne flutes, currently being arranged on her late husband's handcrafted patio tables. Karen had engineered this entire spectacle to force her hand public humiliation or surrender. No other options. "Maya," Mrs. Chen's voice carried a warning. "You don't have to, actually. She does." Karen's clipboard made a sharp crack as she flipped pages. Property maintenance is a community responsibility. We can't have unauthorized structures compromising neighborhood safety. Maya looked past Karen to her backyard, where a small army of vendors was transforming her private sanctuary into something unrecognizable. White tent poles pierced the flower beds Miguel had planted for their anniversary. Strangers' shoes marked the flagstones he'd laid by hand, one by one, during his chemotherapy treatments when he needed projects to keep his mind occupied. Safety, Maya repeated. Exactly. Which reminds me, Karen produced a second document. I'll also need you to sign this liability waiver. Standard procedure when using potentially hazardous structures for public events. The paper fluttered. In the afternoon breeze, Maya caught it, scanning the dense legal text that basically absolved the HOA of any responsibility if her patio collapsed under the weight of Karen's family celebration. You're worried it might collapse. We're being prudent. Due diligence, you understand? Maya understood perfectly. Karen was betting on Miguel's craftsmanship, using his final project as the foundation for her daughter's perfect day, while simultaneously positioning herself to sue Maya into financial ruin if anything went wrong. A crash of cymbals from the backyard made them both turn. The orchestra was setting up directly on the patio's center section, where Miguel had installed additional support beams because he'd planned to put a hot tub there someday. The musicians were arranging their chairs in a precise semicircle around the marble-topped table that had been their last anniversary present to each other. Sign here, Karen said, offering a pen with a little plastic flower attached. And here, initial there. Maya looked at the pen, at the contracts, at Karen's expectant face, at Mrs. Chen's worried expression over the fence, at her backyard, where strangers were hanging string lights from the pergola Miguel had built to frame their morning coffee ritual. You know what? Maya smiled, and something in that expression made Karen take an involuntary step backward. I think this is a wonderful idea. You do, absolutely. Community building, right? Due diligence? Let's see exactly how safe. My husband's work really is. Maya signed with a flourish, each letter deliberate and clear. Karen's relief was palpable as she snatched the documents away. Excellent. I knew you'd see reason. Now if you could just remove any personal items from the reception area. Oh, I think I'll leave everything exactly where it is. Maya's smile widened. Miguel always said his work should speak for itself. For hours later, as Brittany walked down a rose-petal aisle toward her destiny, Maya was in her kitchen making coffee and watching through the window. The patio looked magnificent, she had to admit. White silk everywhere, crystalline light fixtures, 200 guests in their finest formal wear. The cake alone probably cost more than Maya's monthly mortgage payment. She sipped her coffee and waited. Miguel had always been meticulous about his projects. Foundation, depth, load calculations, proper drainage. But he'd also been working. Against time and his failing body to finish this final gift to his wife, Maya remembered finding him out there at 3 a.m. sometimes, headlamp strapped on, struggling with measurements that should have been simple for a man who'd built half the commercial structures in the county. She'd never had the heart to tell him about the shortcuts she'd watched him take. The support beam he'd installed backward, the drainage system he'd connected to the wrong pipe, the foundation corner where his shaking hands had mixed the concrete with too much water. Maya had kept those secrets for 6 months, planning to hire contractors to quietly fix Miguel's mistakes before anyone got hurt. But Karen had changed those plans. The music swelled as Brittany reached the altar. Maya counted heads at least 200 people, all crowded onto a patio designed for family barbecues and quiet morning coffee. Her phone buzzed. A text from Mrs. Chen. Are you watching this circus? Maya typed back. Front row seats? The minister began speaking about love and commitment and building strong foundations. Maya finished her coffee and went to make a second cup. When she returned to the window, the father-daughter dance was beginning. Brittany and her father swayed in the center of the patio, while Karen beamed from the head table, champagne flute raised in triumph. Maya noticed the first crack at exactly 5:47 p.m. It started small, just a hairline fracture in the marble tile near the orchestra section. But Maya knew construction, had watched Miguel work for 23 years of marriage. She recognized the warning signs. The second crack appeared during the best man's speech, spiderwebbing outward from the central support beam. The third crack made a sound. Maya set down her coffee mug and reached for her phone. Emergency services needed a heads up, but she wouldn't make that call just yet. Karen had won. The champagne toast was Karen's idea, naturally. At 6:15 p.m., she climbed onto a chair, one of Maya's patio chairs. Maya noted with bitter irony and tapped her crystal flute with a silver knife until the crowd quieted. "Ladies and gentlemen," Karen's voice carried across the evening air. "I want to thank everyone for joining us in this beautiful space to celebrate Brittany and James." Maya watched from her kitchen window as Karen gestured grandly toward the house. "Some of you know, there's been a little disagreement about this patio. But I think tonight proves that community cooperation can overcome any obstacle." Polite applause rippled through the crowd. Maya counted the cracks now visible in the marble 7 major fractures, dozens of smaller ones spreading outward like a spider web of structural failure. "So let's raise our glasses," Karen continued. "2 new beginnings, strong foundations, and the power of working together." 200 crystal flutes caught the string lights as they lifted skyward. Phone buzzed again. Mrs. Chen, texting from her bedroom window. "Is it just me, or is that table tilting?" Maya looked closer. The head table, where Karen's family sat in their formal finery, had indeed developed a subtle slope. Brittany's wedding cake, 5 tiers of architectural frosting perfection, was beginning to list to one side. "Not just you," Maya texted back. "Physics," the toasts continued. Karen's husband, Bob, stood next to his wife on the increasingly unstable surface, completely oblivious to the way his wingback shoes were pressed against a crack that had widened to nearly half an inch. He launched into a rambling speech about family values and property maintenance that made Maya's teeth ache. "You know," Bob was saying, his voice carrying that particular authority of suburban middle management, "when Karen first told me about this patio situation, I said to her, 'Honey, sometimes you have to take a firm hand with people who don't understand community standards.'" A murmur of agreement from the crowd. Maya noticed several guests shifting uncomfortably, not because of Bob's speech, but because their chairs were no longer sitting level. "Miguel Rodriguez was a good man," Bob continued, raising his glass toward Maya's house, "but good intentions don't replace proper permits and professional installation." The cake chose that moment to shift another 2 inches. Brittany grabbed for it instinctively, her white dress catching on the edge of the tilting table. "Dad," she hissed, "maybe we should." "Nonsense." Karen was back on her feet, steadying the cake with one manicured hand. "This is exactly the kind of fear-mongering that prevents communities from making progress." Maya's phone rang. The caller ID showed her contractor, Jimmy Valdez, the man who'd worked alongside Miguel for 15 years and had been quietly horrified when Maya showed him photos of the patio's construction. "6 months ago, Maya, you need to get those people off that structure right now." "I'm not in charge of those people, Jimmy. I'm looking at your neighbor's Facebook live stream. That patio is going to collapse. Tonight, maybe in the next hour." Maya glanced at her laptop, where Mrs. Chen had indeed started a Facebook live feed titled HOA Karen's Wedding Disaster in Progress. Already 47 viewers and climbing. "How bad?" Maya asked, though she already knew the answer. "Remember what I told you about that corner beam? The one Miguel installed upside down during his bad week in October?" Maya remembered. Miguel had been struggling with medication side effects, his spatial reasoning compromised by the cocktail of drugs, keeping him alive. She'd found him crying in the garage afterward, frustrated by his inability to do the work that had once been second nature. "It's the primary load-bearing support for that section," Jimmy continued. "With the weight distribution from all those people, plus the vibration from the music, plus the additional stress from that goddamn cake table." A crash from the backyard interrupted him. Maya looked out to see one of the orchestra members picking up his fallen music stand. Confusion clear on his face as he tried to understand why his carefully positioned equipment kept sliding toward the center of the patio. "Jimmy, if I call this in, they'll blame me. Karen made sure of that with her liability waivers. If you don't call this in, people are going to get hurt. Really hurt." Maya closed her eyes. She could see Miguel in their bedroom that final week, holding the patio plans with shaking hands, making her promise to hire Jimmy to fix any problems after he was gone. "I'll take care of it," she'd told him then. "Don't worry about anything." But she'd been grieving, overwhelmed, and then Karen had started her campaign of harassment. The demolition demands, the violation notices, the constant pressure to tear down Miguel's final gift. "Maya." Jimmy's voice was urgent. "You still there?" "I'm here." She watched Karen try to level the cake table by sliding magazines under one leg. "Jimmy, how long do we have?" "Hard to say. Could be minutes, could be an hour, but when it goes, it's going to go fast." Maya ended the call and stared at her phone. Emergency services was 3 digits away. She could evacuate the entire reception, save 200 lives, and spend the rest of her existence fighting Karen's lawsuits, while her insurance company battled over who was responsible for what. Or she could wait just a little longer. Laptop chimed with a new Facebook comment on Mrs. Chen's stream. Another comment, "Someone should tell them before someone gets hurt." A third, "Karen Whitmore deserves whatever happens. Remember what she did to the Hendersons' fence." Maya looked back at the reception, where Brittany and James were now having their first dance on increasingly treacherous ground. The bride's heels kept catching in the widening cracks, forcing her new husband to practically carry her through the choreographed routine they'd obviously practiced for months. Karen stood at the edge of the dance floor, phone in hand, recording every moment of her daughter's perfect wedding reception on Maya's disintegrating patio. "Mom," Brittany called out as she stumbled again. "Something's wrong with the floor. It's just settling," Karen called back. "Old construction does that." Maya's doorbell rang. She opened it to find Officer Martinez from the county sheriff's department, his expression grave. Behind him stood a man in a hard hat carrying official-looking equipment. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I'm sorry to bother you, but we've received multiple calls about a possible structural emergency at this address." "Multiple calls?" Martinez gestured toward the street, where Maya now noticed at least a dozen neighbors gathered on the sidewalk. Phones out, all apparently streaming or recording the increasingly chaotic reception. "Ma'am, we need to evacuate that patio immediately." "It's not my event, officer. I'm just the property owner. The HOA board has assumed full liability." The building inspector stepped forward. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I don't care who's liable. That structure is minutes away from catastrophic failure. We need those people out of there now." Maya looked past them to her backyard, where the orchestra was gamely continuing to play, despite the fact that their instruments were slowly sliding toward the center of the patio in a bizarre musical avalanche. "Have you spoken to Mrs. Whitmore? She's the event coordinator. She's refusing to shut down the reception," Martinez said. "Claims we don't have jurisdiction over a private HOA event on permitted property. Is the property permitted?" The building inspector consulted his tablet. "The original patio was permitted, yes, but there's no permit on file for the current structure. Someone added approximately 30% more surface area without proper authorization." Maya blinked. 30%? "Yes, ma'am. Which means the entire structure is legally non-compliant. We can shut this down right now, with or without Mrs. Whitmore's cooperation." Through the chaos, Maya heard Karen's voice rising above the music. "This is harassment. We have rights. This is a private family celebration." The cake table gave up its battle with gravity and tilted another 6 inches. The 5-tier wedding cake, thousands of dollars of architectural sugar, art slid gracefully into the lap of Gratant Mildred, who shrieked and began flailing at the cascade of buttercream and fondant. "Now, would be good," the building inspector said quietly. Maya looked at Officer Martinez. At the inspector, at the growing crowd of neighbors with their phones out, documenting every moment of Karen's perfect wedding reception as it literally fell apart. At Mrs. Chen's Facebook stream, which now had over 200 viewers, and counting, at Karen, who was screaming at the catering staff to fix the cake table, while completely ignoring the fact that her guests were beginning to panic as the ground beneath their feet continued its slow-motion disintegration. "Officer Martinez," Maya said, "I need to ask you something important." "Yes, ma'am." "When this patio collapses natif, when who's going to be held responsible?" Martinez and the inspector exchanged glances. "Well, ma'am, that would depend on a lot of factors: property ownership, permitted status, negligence, failure to maintain safe conditions. What if the property owner tried to warn people? What if she called for evacuation? That would definitely be taken into consideration." Maya pulled out her phone and dialed 911. 911, What's your emergency? This is Maya Rodriguez at 1247 Maple Drive. I need immediate emergency evacuation of approximately 200 people from an unsafe structure on my property. The patio is collapsing, and people are going to get hurt. Karen heard her from across the yard. Karen burst through Maya's front door without knocking, her face flushed with rage and champagne. Hang up that phone right now, Maya continued, speaking calmly to the 911 dispatcher. Yes, I understand. How long until emergency vehicles arrive? I said, hang up. Karen lunged for the phone, but Maya stepped smoothly aside. Estimated 10 minutes. Thank you. Maya ended the call and faced Karen with perfect composure. Can I help you with something? You vindictive bitch. This is my daughter's wedding day, and it's my husband's patio, the one you're destroying. Through the kitchen window, they could see the chaos escalating. Several guests had abandoned their tables and were clustering near the house, instinctively moving toward more stable ground. The orchestra had given up entirely. Their conductor was frantically directing musicians to grab their instruments and retreat to the lawn. But at least 60 people remained on the patio, either too drunk to notice the danger or too polite to leave without permission. This is just another one of your attention-seeking stunts. As if summoned by her words, a loud crack echoed across the yard. One of the support beams, the one Miguel had installed backwards during his worst week, finally gave way with a sound like a gunshot. The eastern corner of the patio dropped 4 inches in an instant. Great Uncle Harold, who'd been sitting at that exact spot nursing his third scotch, found himself suddenly airborne. His chair catapulted him into the hedge, where he landed with a crash that scattered the remaining wedding guests like startled birds. Oh my God! Brittany's scream cut through the evening air. Uncle Harold. Emergency sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer by the second. Karen's face went white as she watched her carefully orchestrated celebration transform into a disaster movie. Tables slid toward the collapsed corner, sending glassware and floral arrangements cascading across the tilting marble. The wedding cake, what remained of it, had become a frosting avalanche that coated half the dance floor in sugary debris. This is your fault, Karen whispered, her voice shaking. You sabotaged it somehow. I didn't have to. Maya's voice was steady, almost gentle. Miguel built it wrong. Karen, he was dying, and his hands were shaken, and he made mistakes. I've known for 6 months that this patio was a death trap. You knew? Karen's voice climbed toward hysteria. You knew and you let us. You threw a party on an unsafe structure after you spent 6 months trying to force me to tear down my husband's final gift. After you made me sign papers taking legal responsibility for your daughter's reception. After you called him a bad contractor in front of 200 people, the first fire truck rounded the corner, followed by 2 ambulances and a police car. Red and blue lights painted the disaster scene in stark, dramatic colors. You could have warned us, Karen said, but her voice had lost its authority. She sounded like what she was, a middle-aged woman who'd finally pushed too far and was about to face the consequences. I tried to warn you 6 months ago when I told you the patio wasn't safe. You called me a liar. I tried to warn you 3 hours ago when I told you Miguel's work should speak for itself. You ignored me. Maya moved toward the window as EMTs rushed toward Uncle Harold. I tried to warn you 20 minutes ago when I called 911. You tried to stop me. Another beam gave way with a thunderous crack. The western edge of the patio sagged dramatically, sending the head table sliding toward the center of the structure. Bob Whitmore, who'd been standing behind his chair delivering another impromptu speech about community values, found himself surf-riding a mahogany table toward the collapsed section. Dad. Brittany hiked up her wedding dress and ran toward the chaos, but James caught her arm. Don't go out there, he said, his voice tight with fear. The whole thing's coming down. The fire chief was already setting up a command post on Maya's front lawn. Through the open door, Maya could hear him barking orders. I need a structural engineer on site immediately. Set up a perimeter 50 feet from the structure. Nobody goes near that patio until we know what we're dealing with. Karen stood frozen in Maya's kitchen, watching her perfect event collapse in real time. The string lights Miguel had hung so carefully were now dragging across the tilting surface, tangled with overturned chairs and scattered rose petals. The marble-topped table Maya and Miguel's anniversary gift to each other had cracked down. The center, It's two halves separated by a growing chasm. My daughter's wedding, Karen whispered, is over, Maya finished. The question now is whether anyone else gets hurt because of your pride. EMTs were loading Uncle Harold onto a stretcher. He was conscious, but clearly shaken, his scotch-soaked tuxedo torn from his encounter with the hedge. Other guests were being checked for injuries to twisted ankles from the uneven surface, cuts from broken glass, shock from the sudden chaos. Officer Martinez appeared at Maya's door. "Ma'am, we need to evacuate this house as well. The structural engineer says there's a possibility of secondary collapse." Karen's phone buzzed. She looked at it with numb fingers, then showed Maya the screen. It was a notification from the neighborhood Facebook group, Live. HOA Karen's wedding reception collapses 62 shares so far. Mrs. Chen's stream had gone viral. "They're all watching," Karen said, her voice hollow. "Everyone's going to see this." "Yes," Maya said simply. "They are." The patio gave one final shuddering groan. The center section, where the dance floor had been, suddenly dropped another 6 inches. The marble tiles that had taken Miguel 3 weeks to install by hand shattered like dominoes, creating a spiderweb of destruction that spread outward from the collapsed support beam. Water began bubbling up from the broken foundation. Drainage system Miguel had connected to the wrong pipe, finally making its contribution to the disaster. "Ma'am," Officer Martinez said urgently, "we really need to go." Maya took one last look at her kitchen, at the window where she'd watched Miguel work on their patio during those final months, where she'd brought him coffee and pretended not to notice when his measurements went wrong, where she'd made the choice to preserve his memory instead of preventing this disaster. She grabbed her purse and followed Karen toward the door. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Officer Martinez said as they reached the front lawn, "I need to ask, did you know the structure was unsafe?" Maya looked at him steadily. "I knew my husband made some mistakes during construction. I'd planned to have them fixed, quietly, before anyone got hurt. But Mrs. Whitmore forced me to choose between protecting my husband's memory and protecting her guests, and you chose your husband's memory. I chose to let Mrs. Whitmore's own actions determine the outcome. She insisted the patio was safe. She assumed legal liability. She refused to evacuate when warned." Maya's voice carried across the crowded lawn, where neighbors and wedding guests were all listening. "I simply stopped protecting her from the consequences of her own decisions." Karen whirled around, her carefully styled hair now disheveled, her makeup streaked with tears. "You wanted this to happen. You planned it." "I didn't plan anything, Karen. I just stopped cleaning up the messes that other people made." The final collapse came at 7:43 p.m., exactly 3 hours and 43 minutes after Brittany had walked down the rose petal aisle. The remaining support beams gave way simultaneously, and the entire eastern half of the patio disappeared into the ground, with a roar that shook windows 3 blocks away. When the dust settled, Maya's backyard looked like a construction site hit by an earthquake. Twisted metal and broken marble created a crater where Miguel's final project had once stood. The pergola had toppled into the neighbor's yard, taking out Mrs. Chen's prize-winning roses. Water from the broken pipes created a muddy lake that reflected the emergency lights. And in the center of it all, somehow still standing upright, was a single white rose from Brittany's bouquet. The building inspector approached Maya with his tablet, his expression grim. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I'm going to need a full report on the construction timeline and any known structural issues." Of course, Maya looked back at the destruction, at Karen standing alone in her ruined designer dress, at Brittany crying in her husband's arms while her perfect wedding photos uploaded to social media as evidence of the disaster. "One more thing," the inspector said quietly. "The city's going to want to know why you didn't report the structural problems earlier." Maya smiled sadly. "Because I thought I was protecting the people I loved. It turns out sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let people face the truth about the foundations they've built their lives on." Karen was already on her phone, probably calling lawyers. The wedding guests were sharing their footage with news outlets. Mrs. Chen's Facebook stream had crashed from too much traffic. And Maya Rodriguez stood in front of the ruins of her husband's final gift, finally understanding what Miguel had been trying to tell her during those last difficult weeks. Sometimes the most important thing about building something isn't making it perfect. It's making sure the people who come after you Understand exactly what you built and why. 3 months later, Maya sat in the county courthouse waiting room watching Karen Whitmore pace the marble floor in her power suit and sensible heels. The confidence that had once made Karen the terror of neighborhood association meetings had been replaced by the manic energy of someone fighting a losing battle on multiple fronts. "Mrs. Rodriguez," the bailiff appeared at the door. "Judge Morrison is ready for you." Maya gathered her files, 3 months' worth of documentation that told the complete story of Miguel's patio, Karen's harassment campaign, and the spectacular collapse that had ended it all. Jimmy Valdez sat beside her, his contractor's license, and 20 years of construction experience serving as her expert witness. "You ready for this?" he asked quietly. "I've been ready since the day Miguel died." The courtroom was packed. Maya recognized faces from the neighborhood Mrs. Chen in the front row. The Hendersons, whose fence dispute with Karen had started her reputation for vindictive enforcement. Even the couple from Oak Street, whose Christmas decorations had triggered a 3-month HOA battle. Karen's lawyer, a sharp-faced woman in an expensive suit, was already at the defendant's table, surrounded by boxes of documents. The HOA had deep pockets and a reputation to protect. They'd hired the kind of legal team that specialized in making problems disappear. Judge Morrison, a thin man with silver hair and no patience for nonsense, called the court to order. "This is a consolidated hearing addressing multiple civil suits arising from the structural collapse at 1247 Maple Drive on March 18th. We have property damage claims, personal injury suits, and allegations of negligent endangerment. Let's start with the facts." Maya's lawyer, David Chun, Mrs. Chun's grandson, and a specialist in construction, lost two to address the court. "Your Honor, the facts are straightforward. Mrs. Rodriguez's deceased husband built a patio that had structural defects. Mrs. Rodriguez was aware of these defects and had planned to repair them. The defendant, Mrs. Whitmore, acting as HOA board president, forced Mrs. Rodriguez to choose between demolishing her husband's final project or allowing it to be used for a large public event. When Mrs. Rodriguez attempted to warn of the danger, Mrs. Whitmore refused to listen and prevented evacuation efforts. Karen's lawyer shot to her feet. "Objection, Your Honor. That's a gross mischaracterization of the events. Mrs. Whitmore was acting within her authority as HOA president to address an unauthorized structure that posed a community safety hazard." Overruled. Continue, Mr. Chen. "Thank you, Your Honor. The evidence will show that Mrs. Whitmore's actions were motivated not by safety concerns, but by personal animosity following Mr. Rodriguez's death. She used her position to harass a grieving widow, and when that harassment escalated to the appropriation of private property for personal use, she created the exact dangerous situation she claimed to be preventing." Judge Morrison made a note. Maya stood slowly, feeling the weight of 3 months of sleepless nights and legal preparation. "Your Honor, I'd like to start by explaining what my husband was trying to build." She walked to the evidence table and picked up a photograph of Miguel at work on the patio during his final summer. Tools laid out with characteristic precision despite the tremor in his hands. Miguel Rodriguez spent 30 years building commercial structures in this county. He knew concrete and steel better than anyone. But when he was dying, when the chemotherapy made his hands shake and his mind fog, he tried to build something perfect for me, something that would last. Maya set down more photographs of the patio in its completed state. The pergola, where they'd shared morning coffee, the marble table that had been their anniversary gift. He made mistakes, I knew that. But I also knew that he'd built something beautiful, something that could be repaired and made safe. Mrs. Whitmore didn't want it repaired. She wanted it destroyed. Karen's lawyer objected, but Judge Morrison waved her down. "Continue, Mrs. Rodriguez." 6 months after my husband's funeral, Mrs. Whitmore began a campaign of harassment designed to force me to demolish the patio. Violation notices, threats of legal action, demands for immediate removal. When I refused, she escalated to public humiliation. Maya pulled out her phone and showed the court a screenshot from Mrs. Chen's Facebook stream. "This is Mrs. Whitmore's daughter's wedding reception held on my private property without my permission, using my deceased husband's construction as the foundation for their celebration, while simultaneously claiming it was unsafe." The courtroom murmured, Several people pulled out their own phones, clearly accessing the viral video that had made Karen's wedding disaster a local legend. Mrs. Whitmore forced me to sign liability waivers while simultaneously betting that my husband's work would support 200 guests. She gambled with other people's safety to prove a point about property compliance. Jimmy Valdez took the stand next, his weathered hands steady as he swore to tell the truth. I worked with Miguel Rodriguez for 15 years. He was the best concrete man in the county. But during his final months, the cancer treatments affected his judgment. He made errors he never would have made when he was healthy. Karen's lawyer cross-examined aggressively. So you're saying the structure was inherently dangerous? I'm saying it had problems that could have been fixed. Miguel knew that. He made Maya promise to hire me to make corrections after he passed. She would have done that, but Mrs. Whitmore didn't give her the chance. Why didn't Mrs. Rodriguez report these problems to the city? Jimmy's expression hardened. Because she was protecting her husband's reputation. Miguel was proud of his work. She didn't want his final project to be remembered as the patio that hurt people. But people did get hurt because Mrs. Whitmore put them in harm's way. Maya tried to fix this quietly. Mrs. Whitmore made it public. The personal injury testimony was devastating. Uncle Harold had suffered 2 broken ribs and a concussion. 3 other guests had sustained injuries from falling debris. The psychological trauma of watching a wedding reception collapse into a sinkhole had affected dozens of people. But the real damage was to Karen's reputation and finances. Mrs. Chen testified about the harassment campaign, producing months of documentation showing Karen's escalating attempts to force Maya's compliance. The neighborhood Facebook group had turned completely against the HOA board, with residents sharing their own stories of Karen's vindictive enforcement actions. She used her position like a weapon, Mrs. Chen said firmly. That poor woman lost her husband, and Karen couldn't even let her grieve in peace. The HOA's insurance company had dropped them entirely after the collapse, leaving Karen and the board personally liable for hundreds of thousands in damages. The wedding venue insurance wouldn't pay out because the event was held on non-permitted property. Brittany's marriage had survived the disaster, but the couple was suing both the HOA and their own parents for the cost of their ruined reception. When Karen finally took the stand, she was a shadow of her former self. Gone was the clipboard-wielding authority figure who'd terrorized neighborhood meetings. In her place sat a woman who'd lost her home, her position, and her family's respect. I was trying to protect the community, she said, her voice barely audible. The patio was a safety hazard. I had to act by throwing a party on it. David Chen's cross-examination was surgical. You claimed the structure was dangerous. Then you put 200 people on it. Which was it, Mrs. Whitmore? Safe enough for your daughter's wedding, or too dangerous for Mrs. Rodriguez to keep? Karen's answer was lost in tears. Judge Morrison's ruling was swift and comprehensive. The HOA was found liable for harassment, trespassing, and negligent endangerment. Karen personally was ordered to pay punitive damages for abuse of authority. The insurance settlements would cover medical bills and property damage, but the real penalty was the complete destruction of Karen's credibility and authority. This court finds that Mrs. Whitmore used her position to wage a personal vendetta against a grieving widow, Judge Morrison stated. Her actions directly created the dangerous situation that led to multiple injuries and property damage. The defendant's claim that she was acting in the community's interest is not supported by the evidence. As the courtroom cleared, Maya found herself face-to-face with Karen in the hallway. The former HOA president looked older, defeated, carrying a single cardboard box that contained the remnants of her once powerful position. I hope you're satisfied, Karen said quietly. I'm not satisfied, Maya replied. I'm just done. Done fighting, done defending, done letting other people decide what my husband's work was worth. Karen looked like she wanted to say more, but instead, she just walked away, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor. Outside the courthouse, Maya found Jimmy waiting by his truck. So what now? He asked. You going to rebuild? Maya looked back at the building where she'd finally gotten justice for Miguel's memory. Actually, I was thinking about that hot tub Miguel always wanted. Think you could help me install it properly this time? Jimmy grinned. I think Miguel would like that. But Maya no more HOA presidents get to use it, right, Jimmy? Maya said, climbing into her car. The next person who tries to throw a party in my backyard, without asking, is going to discover that I learned a lot about foundations. In the last 3 months,